It was late 1944. The war had been going on for 3 years, and our unit was stationed at a remote outpost somewhere in the dense forests of the Pacific region. I won't mention the exact location. Some places are better left unnamed. But I can tell you this: the jungle there was thick, ancient, and filled with secrets. Our mission was simple: patrol the perimeter, watch for enemy movement, and report back. Nothing complicated. I'd done it 100 times before. But that November night was different. I was on solo watch from midnight to 4 a.m. The fog had rolled in thick, making visibility almost zero. I could barely see 10 feet ahead. That's when I first heard them. The sound of boots on wet ground, marching, rhythmic, disciplined. A platoon was approaching our position. I grabbed my rifle and pressed against a tree, watching the dirt path ahead. Through the mist I could see them, soldiers, maybe 30 or 40 of them, walking in perfect formation. They wore uniforms similar to ours, but something felt wrong. The way they moved was too synchronized, almost mechanical. I was about to call out the password when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They cast no shadows. Even in the dim moonlight filtering through the fog, there should have been shadows. But there was nothing. Just their forms moving through the mist like images on a screen. And they made no sound. No footsteps. No equipment rattling. No breathing. Just absolute silence as they marched past my position, not 20 feet away. I stood frozen, my finger on the trigger, but something stopped me from shooting. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was instinct. These weren't the enemy, but they weren't exactly our allies either. The column took nearly 5 minutes to pass. I counted them as they went by. 43 soldiers, each one staring straight ahead with blank expressions. Their faces were pale, almost gray in the moonlight. Some looked young, barely out of high school. Others appeared weathered and tired. One soldier near the end of the column turned his head and looked directly at me. Our eyes met for just a second. His expression wasn't threatening, it was sad. Deeply, profoundly sad. Then he turned away and continued marching with the others until they all disappeared into the fog. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My hands were shaking. My mouth was dry. When I finally found my voice, I radioed back to base, but I didn't know what to say. How do you report something like this? The next morning I told my commanding officer what I'd seen. He listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You're not the first to see them." He explained that other soldiers had reported similar encounters over the past 6 months. Always at night, always in the fog, always the same silent march of shadowless men. The stories were consistent enough that command had started keeping records, though they never made it into official reports. "Who are they?" I asked. He shook his head. "We don't know for certain, but we have theories." My commander pulled out a worn folder from his desk drawer. Inside were handwritten reports, dates, and locations, all carefully documented but never officially filed. He spread them across the table between us. "This area," he began, pointing to our position on the map, "has a history that predates our arrival by several years. In early 1942, just months after America entered the war, a full battalion was deployed to establish the first outpost in this region. 250 men. They were tasked with securing the area and building supply routes through the jungle. It was supposed to be a 3-month operation. After 6 weeks, communication stopped. Command sent a rescue team. What they found confused everyone. The outpost was intact. Supplies were organized. Equipment was maintained. But every single soldier had vanished without a trace. No signs of combat, no indication of retreat. They simply disappeared. The official report called it a tactical withdrawal to avoid enemy capture. But the rescue team's unofficial accounts told a different story. They described an overwhelming sense of dread at the location. Several men reported feeling watched. Others claimed to hear marching at night, though they never saw anyone. The military closed the case, my commander continued. 6 months later, they sent us to re-establish presence here. That's when the sightings began. I looked at the reports. 17 documented encounters over 6 months. All described the same phenomenon. Silent soldiers marching through fog, casting no shadows, acknowledging no one. The descriptions of the uniforms matched those worn by troops in early 1942. Do you believe these men are... I couldn't finish the sentence. I believe something traumatic happened here, he replied carefully. Whether what you're seeing is psychological, environmental, or something else entirely, I can't say. But the pattern is undeniable. He explained a theory some of the older officers discussed quietly. During those early months of the war, soldiers faced extreme conditions, intense heat, disease, isolation, and constant fear. Some military psychologists believe that under such circumstances, groups could experience collective hallucinations or shared trauma responses. But that doesn't explain why different people, months apart, see the exact same thing, I argued. He nodded. That's the part that troubles me most. Over the following weeks, I researched everything I could about the phenomenon. I spoke with soldiers from other units who'd served in the area. 3 had witnessed the Shadow Battalion. Their descriptions matched mine perfectly, down to the sad expression on one soldier's face near the end of the column. One veteran told me something that changed my perspective. He'd seen historical photographs of the original battalion before their disappearance. Among those faces, he recognized several from the Shadow March. I never believed in such things, he said, but I know what I saw. Those men are still here, still following their last orders, still trying to complete a mission that nobody remembers anymore. I began experiencing something new after that conversation. On foggy nights, even when I wasn't on patrol, I could sense when they were near. The air would grow heavy. Sounds would become muffled, and that profound sadness would wash over me like a wave. 3 weeks after my first encounter, I made a decision that went against every military protocol I'd been taught. I decided to approach them. It was December now, and the fog rolled in almost every night. I'd learned to predict when they would appear, always between 2 and 3 a.m., always on nights when the mist was thickest, always following the same route through the jungle. I positioned myself on the path where I'd seen them before. My hands were sweating despite the cool night air. Part of me hoped they wouldn't come. But another part, the part that needed answers, hoped they would. At 2:17 a.m. I felt it, that heavy stillness in the air, the way sound seemed to retreat into the distance. I knew they were coming. They emerged from the fog exactly as before, silent, shadowless, moving in perfect formation. My heart pounded so hard I thought they might hear it, though I knew by now that they seemed unaware of the living world around them. As the column approached, I stepped onto the path directly in front of them. I expected them to stop, to react, to acknowledge my presence in some way. But they didn't. The lead soldier walked straight toward me, and for a moment, I thought he would pass right through me like smoke. At the last second, I stepped aside. The column continued past, their faces forward, eyes unseeing. It was as if I existed in a different reality than they did, 2 worlds occupying the same space but unable to truly touch. Then I noticed something I'd missed before. Their uniforms were damp, not with rain or dew, but with something else. Dark stains covered their clothes, concentrated around certain areas. My military training recognized the pattern immediately. though I didn't want to acknowledge what it meant. These men hadn't simply disappeared. Something had happened to them. Something final. Near the end of the column, I saw him again, the soldier who'd looked at me during my first encounter. This time, I was ready. As he approached, I spoke. "What happened to you?" He stopped. For the first time, the entire column halted. 43 soldiers stood frozen on that foggy path. The silence became even more profound, if that was possible. Then, slowly, the soldier turned his head toward me. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was trying to tell me something, but the words couldn't cross the barrier between his world and mine. His expression was desperate now, not just sad. He needed me to understand. He raised his hand and pointed deeper into the jungle, off the established path, toward an area we'd been ordered never to patrol. Then he pointed to the ground at his feet, then back to the jungle. The gesture repeated 3 times. I understood. He was showing me where to look. Before I could respond, the entire column began to fade. Not walking away, actually fading, like photographs left too long in sunlight. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving only the fog and the heavy silence. I stood there until dawn, trying to process what had happened. I'd made contact. Not much, but enough. They weren't just repeating a pattern mindlessly. They had awareness, they had intention, and they wanted something from the living. They wanted to be found. The next day I did something that could have gotten me court-martialed. I went to the area the soldier had indicated, off-limits and unmarked on any map. What I discovered there would finally explain the Shadow Battalion's eternal march. I waited until the afternoon, when most of the unit was occupied with routine duties. I told my bunkmate I was checking supply lines, a believable excuse that wouldn't raise questions. Then I headed into the restricted zone. The jungle grew denser as I moved off the main path. Vines hung like curtains, and the canopy above blocked most of the sunlight. It felt 10 degrees cooler here, and sounds became muffled, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I walked for about 20 minutes, using the landmarks I'd memorized from the soldiers' gestures. A fallen tree with 3 branches pointing skyward. A cluster of rocks arranged in an unusual pattern. Nature's signposts, leading me deeper. Then I found it. A clearing roughly 50 feet across, hidden so well that you'd never stumble upon it by accident. At first glance, it appeared empty, just another patch of jungle floor covered in leaves and undergrowth, but something felt wrong. The vegetation here was different, younger, as if the ground had been disturbed and nature was still recovering. I began clearing away the leaves with my hands. 6 inches down, I found something that made my stomach turn. Fabric, rotted and discolored, but unmistakably military issue. I kept digging carefully, documenting everything in my mind. What I uncovered over the next hour painted a grim picture. This wasn't just a burial site. It was evidence of something the military had tried very hard to hide. Personal items, identification tags, equipment marked with dates from early 1942, all belonging to the original battalion that had vanished. But here's what troubled me most: the arrangement. Everything was organized, almost ceremonially placed. This wasn't the aftermath of combat. It was deliberate, systematic. Someone had brought these items here and concealed them with great care. I photographed what I could with my military-issue camera, knowing this evidence might be confiscated. As I worked, that familiar heavy feeling returned. The air grew thick. Sound retreated. They were coming, in broad daylight this time. The Shadow Battalion emerged from the tree line, but different now. They moved slower, less mechanically. They formed a circle around the clearing, around me. For the first time, I could see their faces clearly in the filtered sunlight. They were young, so impossibly young, boys who should have been home, going to school dances and worrying about homework. Instead, they'd been sent here, to this forgotten place, where something had gone terribly wrong. The soldier who'd communicated with me stepped forward. He knelt at the edge of the clearing and placed his hand on the ground, a gesture of reverence, like touching a grave. Then he looked at me, and this time I understood without words. They hadn't disappeared. They hadn't retreated. They'd been here all along, trying to show someone, anyone, what had happened. The military had recorded them as missing to avoid uncomfortable questions. But these men knew the truth, and even in whatever state they now existed, they needed that truth acknowledged. I nodded to the soldier, a simple gesture, but it meant everything. I see you. I understand. I'll tell your story. For just a moment, something changed in his expression. The sadness lifted, replaced by something like relief. Then he stood, rejoined the formation, and they all began to fade. But this time, it felt different. Not like they were trapped in a loop, but like they were choosing to leave. As the last figure disappeared, I heard something I'd never heard before. A sound like wind through leaves, but shaped almost like words. Thank you. I remained in that clearing until dusk, gathering what evidence I could carry. I knew returning to base would be complicated. I'd violated direct orders. I'd uncovered something that powerful people wanted to stay buried. But I'd made a promise to those shadow soldiers, and I intended to keep it. I returned to base just after nightfall, carrying the evidence in my pack. My commander was waiting outside the command tent, arms crossed, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Where have you been, soldier?" I could have lied, should have lied, but something about that day, about what I'd witnessed and what those men had endured, made deception feel like a betrayal. "I found them, sir. The original battalion. I know what happened." His face went pale. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and pulled me into his tent, checking to make sure no one else was nearby. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You went to the clearing." It wasn't a question. He already knew. Maybe he'd always known. I emptied my pack onto his desk. The identification tags clinked against the metal surface. Photographs, fabric remnants, a corroded compass with initials carved into the back. Each item a piece of evidence that 250 men hadn't simply vanished. They'd been erased. My commander sat heavily in his chair, looking suddenly much older than his 40 years. He pulled out a bottle from his desk drawer, strictly against regulations, and poured 2 drinks. He slid one across to me. "What I'm about to tell you is classified information," he began. "If you repeat any of this, both of us will face consequences that make court-martial look merciful. Do you understand?" I nodded. He took a long drink, then started talking. In February 1942, the original battalion arrived at this location full of optimism and patriotic spirit. Their mission was straightforward: establish a forward operating base and secure the region. The war was young, and everyone believed it would be over quickly. But within 3 weeks, things began to deteriorate. Not from enemy action, from something else entirely. Soldiers started reporting strange experiences, feelings of being watched, equipment malfunctioning without explanation, men waking up in locations they didn't remember going to, with hours of time unaccounted for. The battalion's medical officer documented it all in detailed reports. He theorized they were experiencing a form of collective stress reaction, possibly triggered by environmental factors unique to the region. Some areas of the world, he noted, seemed to affect human psychology in ways science couldn't yet explain. Command dismissed these reports. They ordered the battalion to maintain position and continue their duties. Mental health wasn't a priority in 1942. Toughness was. Then came the incident. One night in early March, something happened that the official records describe only as a complete breakdown in unit cohesion. Reading between the lines of classified documents my commander had seen, it appeared the entire battalion experienced a shared psychological event, something so overwhelming that it shattered their collective grip on reality. They didn't die in combat, my commander said quietly. They died from fear itself, mass panic, cardiac events, some form of psychological shock that medical science in 1942 couldn't understand or explain. The military faced an impossible situation. How do you tell the American public that an entire battalion was lost, not to the enemy, but to something far more disturbing and inexplicable? How do you maintain morale when soldiers are literally being frightened to death by an invisible threat? So they made a decision. They buried the evidence, both literally and figuratively. The bodies and belongings were placed in that clearing. The incident was recorded as tactical withdrawal. Families received letters saying their sons were missing in action, presumed lost. The truth was sealed in classified files that wouldn't be opened for decades. But they're still here, I said, still trying to complete their mission, still marching. My commander nodded slowly. Trauma leaves impressions, whether that's psychological, spiritual, or something else entirely, I don't know. But yes, something of them remains. Something that won't rest until their story is acknowledged. He gathered up the evidence from his desk and locked it in his safe. This material can't leave this tent. You understand that, don't you? If this gets out, it could undermine public confidence in the military during wartime. The implications are too dangerous. I understood the logic, but I also understood something else. Those shadow soldiers had trusted me with their truth. They'd waited years for someone to see them, really see them, and acknowledge what happened. What am I supposed to do? I asked. You do your duty. You complete your service. And maybe, someday when this war is over and enough time has passed, you find a way to tell this story. Not as classified information or military scandal, but as a reminder that we owe something to the men who serve, even when that service leads to outcomes nobody wants to talk about. The weeks following my discovery were the strangest of my entire service. I continued my regular duties, patrols, maintenance, guard rotations, but everything felt different now. I carried a secret that weighed heavier than any equipment I'd ever shouldered. The Shadow Battalion's appearances changed after that day in the clearing. They came less frequently, but when they did, there was a new quality to their presence, less desperate, more peaceful perhaps, as if acknowledging their truth had given them something they'd been searching for. Other soldiers began noticing changes too. The overwhelming dread that had hung over our outpost for months started to lift. Men slept better. The equipment malfunctions decreased. It was subtle, but everyone felt it. The atmosphere had shifted. One soldier, a corporal named Henderson who'd been stationed there longer than anyone, pulled me aside one evening. "Something's different," he said. "You feel it too, right? Like the jungle isn't angry anymore." I didn't tell him what I knew. I couldn't. But I understood what he meant. It was as if the land itself had been holding on to trauma, and now, finally, it could begin to let go. My final encounter with the Shadow Battalion came in late December, just days before I was scheduled to rotate out. I wasn't on patrol. I'd simply felt drawn to walk the perimeter one last time. The fog was light that night, more mist than the thick curtains I'd grown accustomed to. They appeared at exactly 2:30 a.m., but this time only a dozen of them. The rest of the column was gone, their purpose apparently fulfilled. The soldier who'd communicated with me was among those remaining. He stood at the front of this smaller group, and when he saw me, he did something unexpected. He saluted. It was a proper military salute, crisp and respectful. I returned it immediately, my hand snapping to my forehead with all the precision my training had instilled. We held that position for several seconds, a final acknowledgement between soldiers separated by circumstances neither of us fully understood. Then he smiled. It was barely visible in the dim light, but I saw it clearly. For the first time since I'd encountered these men, one of them looked at peace. The remaining soldiers began to fade, but differently than before. This time they didn't simply disappear into the mist. They seemed to rise, gradually becoming translucent, then transforming into something like light before vanishing completely. It reminded me of fog burning off under morning sun, natural, gentle, almost beautiful. I stood alone on that jungle path, knowing I'd witnessed something most people would never believe. But I also knew with absolute certainty that those men had finally been released from whatever had bound them to this place. The next morning, I reported for my final briefing before rotation. My commander handed me my orders and a sealed envelope. "Open this when you get home," he said quietly. "Not before." I nodded, understanding this was his way of giving me permission, or perhaps instructions, for what came next. As my transport left the outpost, I looked back at the jungle one last time. The morning sun was breaking through the canopy, and for the first time in months, the place looked almost welcoming. Whatever darkness had lingered there was finally gone. I returned home in January 1945. The war in Europe was entering its final stages, though none of us knew it yet. I was granted 30 days leave before my next assignment. 30 days to try to feel normal again after everything I'd experienced. The sealed envelope remained in my duffel bag for 3 days. I wasn't ready to open it. Part of me wanted to leave that entire chapter in the jungle where it belonged. But on the 4th night, curiosity won. Inside was a single handwritten letter from my commander, along with several photocopied pages. The letter was brief. "These are excerpts from the 1942 medical officer's reports, the only copies that exist outside classified archives. I'm trusting you with them because those men trusted you. When enough time has passed, when it's safe to do so, tell their story. Not the classified details, not the military failures, but the human truth. They deserve to be remembered as soldiers who served, not as a statistic buried in forgotten files. Destroy this letter after reading." I burned the letter as instructed, but the medical reports, those I kept hidden in a locked box, waiting for the right time. The photocopied pages were chilling to read. The medical officer, a Dr. William Patterson, had documented everything with scientific precision. He described how the psychological deterioration began slowly. Soldiers reporting nightmares that multiple men shared, experiencing the same dream on the same night. Feelings of temporal displacement, where hours would pass in what felt like minutes. Dr. Patterson theorized they'd encountered what he called environmental psychological stress factors, something about the location itself that affected human consciousness in ways medical science couldn't yet explain. He referenced studies from World War I about shell shock, but noted this was different. This wasn't trauma from combat, it was something intrinsic to the place itself. His final report, dated March 7, 1942, was the most disturbing. He described an incident where the entire battalion experienced what he termed collective acute anxiety response. In modern terms, we might call it mass panic attack, but that doesn't capture the severity he documented. Men collapsed simultaneously. Some never regained consciousness. Others remained in catatonic states, unresponsive to external stimuli. Within 72 hours, the entire battalion had succumbed to various manifestations of what appeared to be fear-induced physiological failure. Dr. Patterson's final words haunted me. I believe this location harbors something that human minds are not meant to encounter. Future deployments to this area should be reconsidered. However, I suspect this report will be classified and my recommendations ignored. May God have mercy on anyone else sent here. He was right. His recommendations were ignored. That's why my unit ended up there 2 years later. But here's what struck me most about those reports. Dr. Patterson never described what the soldiers actually experienced, what they saw, heard, or felt that triggered such catastrophic responses. That information was either lost or deliberately omitted. I spent years wondering about that missing piece. What had those men encountered that was so overwhelming, so fundamentally incompatible with human psychology, that it literally frightened them beyond the point of survival? Then, one evening in 1947, I received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man appeared at my door, introducing himself as Robert Patterson, son of Dr. William Patterson. He'd spent 2 years tracking down soldiers who'd served at that outpost, trying to understand what happened to his father, who'd passed away in 1943, never recovering from whatever he'd witnessed. My father kept a personal journal, Robert said, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Separate from his official reports, he wrote about things he couldn't put in military documents, things he saw that last night. He handed me the journal. I think you're someone who might understand, someone who might have seen it too. I invited Robert Patterson inside, and we sat at my kitchen table as I carefully opened his father's journal. The pages were yellowed and fragile, filled with tight handwriting that became increasingly erratic as the entries progressed. The early entries from January 1942 were mundane: weather observations, supply inventories, routine medical examinations. But by mid-February, the tone shifted dramatically. February 18th, third soldier this week reporting identical nightmares. They describe a presence in the jungle, not hostile, but observing, waiting. I've begun interviewing each man separately to rule out suggestion or shared storytelling. Their accounts remain consistent despite isolation from one another. February 24th. The phenomenon is spreading. Now 27 men report the same experiences. They describe feeling watched during patrols. Several claim to see figures moving parallel to their position, but when investigated, nothing is found. I'm concerned this may be early-stage psychosis, but the simultaneous onset across multiple individuals defies standard psychological models. The entries grew more disturbing through early March. Dr. Patterson documented temporal anomalies, soldiers losing track of time, entire patrols returning hours late with no memory of the missing period, equipment malfunctioning in ways that violated basic physics, compasses spinning without pattern, watches running backward. Then came the entry dated March 6, 1942, the night before the incident. I've made a terrible discovery. The local terrain features match descriptions from indigenous accounts I found in the base library. This area was considered forbidden ground long before our arrival. The translations are imprecise, but they reference something the native peoples called the place where time circles back on itself. They believed certain locations hold memories, not metaphorically, but literally. Places where traumatic events leave permanent impressions that echo forward through time. My hands trembled as I read. Dr. Patterson had discovered what I'd only begun to suspect. If their beliefs hold any truth, he continued, then we may have established our base on ground that has witnessed something catastrophic in the past. And we are now experiencing that past event as it bleeds through into our present reality. The soldiers aren't going mad, they're perceiving something that exists outside normal temporal boundaries. The final entry was dated March 7th, written in shaky handwriting. It happened tonight. The entire battalion saw them, soldiers from another time, another war, marching through our camp. They appeared solid, real, but cast no shadows in our lamplight. When our men tried to interact, the apparitions didn't respond. They simply marched through our position as if we didn't exist. Then our soldiers understood. They weren't seeing ghosts from the past, they were seeing themselves from the future. They were witnessing their own deaths, their own eternal march, playing out before it had even occurred. The shock of this recognition, of seeing their own fate, proved more than human psychology could withstand. I am the only one still conscious to write this. The others have all collapsed. Some still breathe, but they're unresponsive.
Trapped in some state between life and death. I suspect I will join them soon. The realization is overwhelming. We are already the ghosts. We have always been the ghosts. Time in this place doesn't move forward. It circles, trapping us in an eternal loop of our own demise. If anyone reads this, do not send more men here. This ground is cursed not by supernatural forces, but by the nature of reality itself. Some places exist outside linear time, and human consciousness cannot survive the paradox of witnessing its own end. The journal ended there. Robert Patterson looked at me with hollow eyes. My father died 3 months later in a military hospital. The official cause was heart failure, but I've always believed he died from what he witnessed, from understanding something humans aren't meant to understand. I closed the journal carefully, my mind racing. Dr. Patterson's theory explained everything. The Shadow Battalion wasn't haunting the jungle. They were trapped in a temporal loop, eternally marching toward a fate they'd already experienced. And when my unit arrived years later, we'd been witnessing that loop playing out across time. But there was one piece that still didn't fit. If they were trapped in an eternal cycle, how had they broken free? What had changed when I acknowledged their presence? Robert Patterson and I spent the next several hours discussing his father's theories. As a physicist who'd studied at Princeton before the war, Robert had his own interpretation of the phenomenon. Quantum mechanics suggests that observation affects reality, he explained, pulling out papers covered in equations I barely understood. In laboratory conditions, particles exist in multiple states until observed. My father believed something similar might apply to traumatic events in certain locations. He drew a diagram on my notepad, circles within circles, representing time loops. Imagine trauma as energy that gets trapped in a specific location. In most places, this energy dissipates naturally. But in rare instances, geographic and temporal conditions create what my father called echo chambers, places where traumatic energy can't escape. It circles back on itself, creating a loop. Like the Shadow Battalion, I said. Exactly. But here's the critical part. These loops exist outside normal causality. Past, present, and future become entangled. Your unit wasn't seeing ghosts from 1942. You were seeing an event that exists outside linear time, playing repeatedly like a record stuck on the same groove. I thought about Dr. Patterson's final words, that the battalion had witnessed their own future deaths, and that paradox had destroyed them. So when they saw themselves as the Shadow Battalion, I said slowly, they saw their own fate. That created the trauma, which created the loop, which they then witnessed, creating the trauma again. Robert nodded grimly. A perfect paradox. Self-sustaining, self-perpetuating. No beginning,
no end. "But they're gone now," I said. "I saw them leave. What changed?" Robert leaned forward, his expression intense. "That's what I've been researching for 2 years. I believe the answer is consciousness. Specifically, external observation with understanding and acknowledgement." He explained that most witnesses to the phenomenon merely observed without comprehending. They saw something strange and fled or reported it, but never truly engaged with the reality of what they were witnessing. "But you," he said, "you did something different. You didn't just see them, you investigated. You uncovered their truth. You acknowledged their experience not as a mystery or anomaly, but as real soldiers who suffered a real tragedy. You bore witness." The phrase struck me. Bore witness. "In quantum terms," Robert continued, "your conscious observation with understanding may have provided the external reference frame necessary to collapse the probability loop. By acknowledging their reality, you gave them an endpoint, a way for the trapped energy to finally resolve and dissipate. It was a beautiful theory, though I wasn't sure I fully grasped the physics. But I understood the essential truth. Those men had been trapped not just by temporal anomaly, but by being forgotten, dismissed, officially erased. When someone finally acknowledged their truth, really saw them and honored their experience, the loop could finally end. "My father wrote one more thing," Robert said quietly, pulling out a separate page that had been tucked in the journal's back cover. He wrote this the night before he passed away. The note was simple. "The dead ask so little of the living, only to be remembered truthfully. That is the key to releasing all ghosts, whether metaphorical or real. Acknowledgement is liberation." I sat back, overwhelmed by the implications. How many other tragedies remained trapped in loops of forgotten suffering? How many voices echoed unheard through time, waiting for someone to finally bear witness? "So what do we do now?" I asked. Robert gathered his father's papers carefully. "We document this, not for military files or classified reports, but for history. We ensure these men are remembered, not as missing persons or casualties of unexplained circumstances, but as soldiers who experienced something beyond the boundaries of understood reality and paid the ultimate price. But the military will never allow—" "Not now," Robert interrupted, "but someday, when enough time has passed, when the classifications expire and the truth can be told without political consequence. Someday their story will be ready to be heard." That was 70 years ago. Robert Patterson and I maintained contact throughout our lives, carefully preserving the documentation of what we'd witnessed and learned. We waited, as we'd promised, for the right time to share this story. Robert passed away in 2003. Before he died, he entrusted me with all his research, his father's journal, and a single request: "Tell the story when you're ready. Those men have waited long enough." I'm 94 years old now. The military classifications have long since expired. Everyone involved in the cover-up has passed on. There's no one left to protect, no careers to ruin, no political consequences to fear. Only a truth that deserves to be told. I've spent decades researching similar phenomena. What I've learned is both fascinating and unsettling. The Shadow Battalion wasn't unique. Throughout history, there are documented cases of places where traumatic events seem to echo across time. Battlefields where soldiers report seeing ancient conflicts. Disaster sites where witnesses describe scenes from decades past. Locations where the boundaries between past and present appear unusually thin. Modern physics has begun catching up to what Dr. Patterson theorized in 1942. Scientists now discuss concepts like quantum entanglement, observer effects, and the possibility that consciousness itself may interact with reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. Some researchers have even proposed that intense emotional events, particularly trauma experienced collectively, might leave measurable impressions on the physical environment. But beyond the science, there's a simpler, more human truth at the heart of this story. Those 250 young men who vanished in 1942 weren't casualties of war in the traditional sense. They were casualties of something far more mysterious. Victims of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. And then they became casualties a second time, when their truth was buried, their sacrifice erased, their very existence denied for the sake of military expediency. They were trapped not just by temporal anomaly, but by being forgotten. What freed them wasn't advanced technology or military intervention. It was something far simpler. Acknowledgement. Someone finally saw them, investigated their truth, and honored their experience. That simple act of bearing witness broke a loop that had held them for years. I think about that lesson often. How many of us carry our own loops, unacknowledged traumas, unspoken truths, experiences that circle endlessly in our minds because no one has truly witnessed them? How many historical events remain trapped in cycles of denial and erasure, waiting for someone brave enough to finally acknowledge what happened? The Shadow Battalion taught me that the past isn't as fixed as we believe. Unacknowledged truth has a weight that persists across time. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do for those who came before us is simply to see them clearly, tell their story truthfully, and say, "This happened. It mattered. And you are remembered." I've kept this story private for 70 years, honoring the promise I made to my commander and to Robert Patterson. But now, in my final years, I'm sharing it with you, because those 43 young men and the 207 others who vanished with them deserve to be remembered not as mysteries or anomalies, but as soldiers who served their country and paid a price that no one should have to pay. If you're listening to this story, you've become part of that remembrance. You're bearing witness too, and perhaps, in some way we don't fully understand, that matters. The Shadow Battalion marches no more. They found their peace when someone finally acknowledged their truth. May we all be so fortunate when our time comes to be seen, understood, and remembered for who we truly were. This is their story. This is my story. And now, it's part of yours too. Thank you for listening to the Shadow Battalion. Remember, the past never truly dies. It simply waits to be acknowledged.